not only US War Cabinet members, but also their deputies and other key players together recall their personal memories of the Gulf crisis. They start their story with Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait.
Sir Charles, where were you?
I was in Aspen, Colorado, where I'd just arrived with Mrs. Thatcher, who was there for a meeting with the president the following day. She was staying in the ranch of Ambassador Cato, just outside Aspen. I'd just gone into the hotel. The news came through in a cable from London, a flash cable. I telephoned her straight away out at the ranch, where she was busy unpacking her suitcases.
Mr. Wilson.
We were 8 hours ahead, so it was about 4 o'clock in the morning, and got this phone call. I went over to the telephone and picked it up, and the voice on the other end said, it's the White House calling. So I stood to attention and saluted. I was in my all-together, stark naked. And the phone went dead. So I had to call back and got a hold of Richard's office, and it was his deputy who said, did you have Saddam Hussein's home phone number? I didn't have it on me at the time.
You didn't have anything?
I didn't have anything on it at the time.
I had gone over to town to meet with a friend, and we were simply having a cocktail together when my beeper went off and said, come back immediately.
General Scowcroft and I talked for maybe half an hour, and then it was probably 7 o'clock, 7:30 that evening. He and I decided to walk over from his office in the West Wing of the White House over to the residence to meet with the president. 3 of us were talking about exactly what we knew, what we didn't know, what our options were, and as often happens, the telephone rang. It was Bob Kimmett on the line.
I also called the secretary immediately. By that time, I believe he was in the meeting with Foreign Minister Shevardnadze.
But when we told him that the invasion had actually occurred and that we had actually begun and that we had solid information to this effect, he was a little, I think, a little bit embarrassed and surprised.
Знаете, я ему сказал, что я не верю этому. Не верю. Не потому, что Саддам не может это сделать, ну просто нет логики, элементарной логики. Джеймс Роде согласился, да, я, говорю, согласен, но вот такое сообщение имеется.
What we have is this closed-circuit video television network, if you will, so people can stay at their home agencies and they don't have to waste time traveling and so forth. So Brent and I and some of the people who work with me were down in the White House Situation Room. Bob and his people were at State. Paul Wolfowitz and others were at the Pentagon. The CIA people came in from the agency. And from about 8:30, give or take, that evening till maybe 1:30, 2:30 in the morning, what we really had was a running deputies meeting.
On the 1st of August in the evening, I was having dinner. It was a farewell dinner for Sir Crispin Quayle with one other couple present, when all of a sudden, about 10 o'clock at night, I was called to the phone, went to the waiter station in the hall to the kitchen and got a call from the State Department saying that Iraq had invaded Kuwait, and I was instructed to call an immediate meeting of the Security Council.
The most important thing was really diplomatically to get what ultimately became the foundation, the first of over a dozen United Nations resolutions to make sure that you had the world community squarely against what had happened, calling for its complete and unconditional reversal.
Now, Sir Charles, you were involved in that.
There was a lot of consultation going on in New York immediately between Ambassador Pickering and our Ambassador Sir Crispin Quayle and no doubt many others to get the council together and to have a very, very rapid resolution.
We finished the dinner. I alerted Sir Crispin. In my car on the way to the Security Council, I was able to find the Kuwaiti ambassador who hadn't heard about this. And I went immediately back to my apartment, worked with the Department of State on the phone. We composed a resolution which was pretty much accepted as is.
In New York at the United Nations, the Security Council met through the night, first informally and then in emergency session.
So far, the only tangible response has been economic. America freezing Kuwait's assets there to keep them from Iraqi hands.
I got a call that day from the White House with regard to the freezing of assets, because there was no one in my government that I was able to get any instructions from. And I had to take the initiative to say yes or no, because there was this whole confusion and no one was in a position to give any instructions. And they said, we need your authority to freeze the Kuwaiti assets. I said, of course you have my authority to freeze the Kuwaiti assets before the Iraqis are able to get their hands on.
I met on the morning of August 2nd with Tariq Aziz, the foreign minister, at about 8:30 that morning. They had cut our telephones to Washington at about 6 o'clock. In fact, I had been on the telephone with Nat Howell in Kuwait when they cut our international lines. So I met with Tariq on the 2nd, laid out what the U.S. position, the UN position, on one country invading another UN member state.
It's now 8 a.m. on the 2nd in Washington, and there is a National Security Council meeting about to begin. What was going on at that meeting?
Well, before the meeting, there were two things going on that I remember. I went back to Brent's office. By this point, I had given up using my own because it meant an extra 2 minutes over to the old executive office building. Typed out a statement, brought it back to Brent and the president. Then at 8 o'clock, the press was brought in, not just for the photo op, but to stay there to hear this statement.
We're not discussing intervention. I would not discuss any military options, even if we'd agreed upon them. But one of the things I want to do at this meeting is hear from our Secretary of Defense, our chairman, and others, but I'm not contemplating such action.
The president, from the very outset, never ruled any option out. He told us that privately. He conveyed that publicly. But we were not at that point looking at intervention as the best option. It was way too premature.
And the next phone call I got from Colin was, well, they're now, we've just got reports that they're in downtown Kuwait. That made it an entirely different situation.
Within 12 hours after we got word that the attack had begun, and while we were still watching it unfold, General Schwarzkopf briefed the president and the other members of the National Security Council on what our options could be.
Mr. Wolfowitz, what were the options that were circulating at the table that morning?
One thing I remember about that meeting was that there was a very extensive discussion of all the kinds of things you might try to do through purely political and diplomatic means. So although there was not a lot of discussion in that meeting, as I recall it, about military options, there was a very exhaustive attempt to see what you could do without the use of force, and at least to those of us from the Defense Department sitting there, it was pretty clear where all of that led.
We were all apprehensive that Saddam Hussein was not just going to stop in Kuwait, but would continue to the major Saudi oil fields on the east side of the Gulf. At about 2 a.m. that first night, the Director of Central Intelligence, Judge Webster, and I met with the head of Saudi intelligence to talk with him about what contingencies might be required if Saddam kept moving through Kuwait.
And I spoke to Ambassador Kelly hours after the invasion took place. And I believe he was at home. He was called back to the State Department, and the moment he got to the State Department, he called me back, and we were talking about it. And the next day, the 2nd, I had a meeting with Paul Wolfowitz at the Department of Defense to assess the situation. I had a press conference at 10 o'clock in the morning on the 2nd of August, where I took the initiative myself to call for a U.S. intervention here.
We have appealed to all our friends. And I repeat, we have appealed to all our friends around the world, including the United States, to come to our aid and assistance.
We have been in almost hourly contact with the Kuwaiti ambassador over the last 24 hours, and we're going to continue to work closely together.
And I called John again, and I said, John, he said, are you asking? I said, yes, I am asking. And although I did not have instructions from my government because there was nobody else be able to get in touch with. And that was really the nightmare I had on that day, is I was praying to God, please stop in Kuwait, because as unfortunate as we were to have our country invaded, had he gone into Saudi Arabia, then Kuwait would not have been the primary focus of the world, but rather of Saudi Arabia and other countries. We would have been left on the sideline.
As her plane landed at the Rocky Mountain airstrip, Mrs. Thatcher was being kept informed of events in the Gulf. She's now unreservedly condemned the Iraqi invasion as absolutely unacceptable.
When the president left for Aspen, he had some understanding of the state of our planning and what possibilities existed. Not specific options, but a range of possibilities that he should consider as he thought about this in the course of his trip to Aspen and back.
And the president and I discussed it at length going out to Aspen, and especially the significance of what had happened, more than simply one country invading another little country. That what did it all really mean?
President and Mrs. Thatcher met in Ambassador Catto's ranch, perhaps a slightly unlikely place, tucked up in the hills 10 miles outside Aspen. It was a relaxed meeting, a large room, comfortable room, just the President and Mrs. Thatcher and General Scowcroft, and I was there too.
The President was ready for what Mrs. Thatcher came with, which was the same idea that this is more than just another case of a border incursion or something. This has great significance. So there was a meeting of mind of two. They were both heading in the same direction, and they tended to reinforce each other.
It's been said that Mrs. Thatcher had to put backbone into the president. That's just wrong. I mean, they both arrived there absolutely determined that this was something which could not be tolerated. I think the genuine sense of outrage was the thing I remember most strikingly on the part of both of them, that this should have happened. I think also a slight feeling of history, a memory of what had happened when, in the 1930s, we had failed to move to protect small countries when they had been invaded.
Iraq's invasion of Kuwait defies every principle for which the United Nations stands. If we let it succeed, no small country can ever feel safe again.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States.
President Bush gave a midday speech that day, which, ironically, involved the Middle East.
The strategic essence was to change the focus of our defense planning from a global war with the Soviet Union to dealing with regional conflicts. And in fact, in our secret planning, the regional conflicts that were of the greatest concern were in the Persian Gulf, like an Iraqi invasion of Saudi Arabia. This had been planned to be a major unveiling of a new defense strategy, but of course no one noticed in all the other things going on.
The brutal aggression launched last night against Kuwait illustrates my central thesis. Notwithstanding the alteration in the Soviet threat, the world remains a dangerous place with serious threats to important U.S. interests wholly unrelated to the earlier patterns of the U.S.-Soviet relationship.
The two of them then drove back to the ranch, and they had a further discussion there. And the second time, I think the military aspects were rather more in their mind. Not, as I recall it at that stage, the need perhaps to use force to eject Iraq from Kuwait.
What were the Iraqis likely to do? Were they simply going to stop at Kuwait? Could they just continue marching on down the border into the Saudi oil fields, which were right in the line of march, and what in fact could be done to stop that sort of a thing?
What's going on in the Gulf?
Any new developments, Mr. President?
No, I had a long talk with King Fahd just now.
What did he want?
Well, we're just reviewing options. And
while everything is scurrying about from Aspen to the UN to Washington, there you are in Siberia. What was the Secretary's reaction? At that point, he goes to Mongolia.
Right, and I flew off on Shevardnadze's plane and flew back to Moscow with the Soviet team. It became rather fortuitous that I was doing so. The Secretary told me, his last words to me were, "Stay in touch." And
we got to Mongolia, and the full dimensions of the invasion became apparent. I remember going through with the events that we had planned there, without being able to concentrate too much on exactly what was happening. But coming back to the guest house there in Ulaanbaatar to spend the night and spending practically all of the night on the phone. I talked on several occasions to the president, secure from there, and then talked to Brent Scowcroft.
Well, you know, how do we adjust to this and so on, rather than the notion that this was an unacceptable move, that the United States, that it could not be allowed to succeed. It was more adjusting to it rather than resisting or reversing it.
You reach Moscow, and what's going through your head?
When I got there, Peter Hauslohner, who was someone who was on my staff, suggested to me the idea of having a joint statement with the Soviets. I thought it was a terrific idea, and I called the secretary and I said, I think we ought to have not only a joint statement, but I think you ought to come back here to give it with Minister Shevardnadze, because that will give it real drama, and that will demonstrate for the world to see that the United States and the Soviet Union are right together.
I told him to look further into that, follow up on it, and that if it looked for sure like we could get such a joint statement, then I would come back. I'd cancel the balance of my trip to Mongolia, and I was returning to Washington. I would return to Washington through Moscow.
We had actually planned in advance of the meeting for Sergei Tarasenko, who is Shevardnadze's assistant, and myself to get together to be talking about a range of different issues. And as we walked into his office, the first thing he said to me was, let's find out the latest information. So I thought he was going to pick up the phone and he was going to check on their intelligence to find out what was going on. And instead, he goes over and turns on CNN. We then drafted a very quick statement and found a typewriter in English. I mean, we found a non-Cyrillic typewriter and typed it out. He read it over. He called up Shevardnadze and read it to him. Shevardnadze said, sounds good, and I like the idea. Let me call Gorbachev.
We flew the next day to Moscow, met with Shevardnadze in the Moscow airport.
A smiling James Baker arrived at Moscow airport this evening for this brief, hurriedly arranged visit, an opportunity to cash in on the new togetherness between Moscow and Washington. Separately, the United States and the Soviet Union are potent forces. Together, they hope to convince the Iraqis they are unbeatable.
This was a hard decision for the Soviets to take. They had supported Iraq for a long time. They had 8,000, I remember him telling me they had 8,000 Soviet citizens in Iraq, and they were concerned that they were, by doing this, they might be somehow giving us a license for military action, and they wanted us to give them certain assurances that that would not be the case. Shevardnadze said at the time, he said, when the secretary told me a day or so ago that this might be imminent, I was frankly disbelieving of it, and I was quite surprised, and nevertheless, this is something that should not be permitted to happen, and they went forward with a very good joint statement.
Today, we take the unusual step of jointly calling upon the rest of the international community to join with us in an international cutoff of all arms supplies to Iraq.
It's now August 3rd, and the second 8 a.m. NSC meeting takes place.
You had the three senior people at the meeting besides the president. You had Brent Scowcroft, Larry Eagleburger, and Dick Cheney. Each gave a several-minute statement at the beginning.
I had told the president that I was concerned, and I thought we had to get over the significance of this in the world that we were living in, and that if he didn't mind, I would do what I don't usually do at NSC meetings, and that is open the meeting with a statement of the larger significance of this. And he said, well, maybe I should do that. And I remember saying, no, I think it's better that I do and you sit back and let the debate develop. So that's what I did, and try to set it in a broader stage of the overall significance to U.S. vital interests of what had happened.
I told President Bush what was brought home by Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait was that he did not have to take Saudi Arabia in order to dominate the Gulf. Once he had Kuwait, he had some 20% of the world's oil reserves, and he had the largest army in the neighborhood. He was in a position to dictate policy to everybody else in the Gulf.
The general thrust of what I said
was essentially that, Mr. President, this is a far more important issue than simply the invasion of Kuwait, important as that is. This is, in its own way, the first real test of this new world order that we're trying to put together. And if this aggression is permitted to proceed, it sets all the wrong standards for that new world order. It sends messages to the Gaddafis, the Kim Il-sungs, etc., that, if you will, with the collapse of the bipolar world, with the removal of one of the two superpowers, in fact, perhaps the rules of the game have changed, and the pipsqueaks like Saddam Hussein can do more rather than less because they aren't constrained by their big brother. And under these circumstances, it's absolutely essential that the U.S. collectively, if possible, but individually, if necessary, not only put a stop to this aggression, but roll it back.
These are large geopolitical stakes.
Well, thank you.
However you assess the stakes, this was going to be a turning point. It was the first test of what you might call the post-Cold War era, and everybody knew that there was just a sense, a palpable sense of history in the room.
Is it your sense on the 3rd that the president was sharing these views as expressed?
Oh, very much so. The only reason the president held back, I think, based on everything I know from the day, was that once the president speaks at a meeting, it certainly sets a tone, and it can inhibit what other people are prepared to see.
You might say.
You might say.
We view it as a matter of grave concern to this country and internationally as well. What Iraq has done violates every norm of international law.
On day 3, news bulletins reported that if the Iraqis continued to threaten Saudi Arabia, President Bush might use the military option. The build-up of U.S. naval power continued, with carrier-led forces from both the Indian Ocean and the Mediterranean heading towards the Gulf. But where to base land forces was an open question.
I remember looking at the map, talking with our experts in the Pentagon, trying to figure out how you would counter 150, 200,000 Iraqi troops, tanks, heavy forces that Saddam had deployed to Kuwait. And it was apparent when you look at the map that unless you can get into Saudi Arabia, there's very little you can do.
Saddam might well have not intended to invade Saudi Arabia, but there must